Good afternoon, and welcome to the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics at the University of Kansas. And thank you for attending today's program, which is presented in partnership with the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. My name is Amy Cummings, and I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student organization of the Institute. The Dole Institute of Politics strives to promote a new era of leadership that uses politics to bring people together through opportunities that emphasize bipartisan cooperation, public service, and civic education and engagement, all of which is inspired by the leadership and service of Senators Bob and Elizabeth Dole and the enduring civic contributions of the greatest generation. The Student Advisory Board is an integral part of this mission, providing members with experiential learning and job opportunities, access to financial assistance, and networking opportunities with our special guests. If you are a student here at KU and would like to join, please email us at dolesab@ku.edu or speak with a student worker after the program. Before we begin, there are a few reminders I'd like to take a moment to share with you. Following today's program, a video recording will be available to stream on demand on our YouTube channel, where you can access a full catalog of our past programming. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. The Institute also has a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system, or if at any time you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. Please take a moment to familiarize yourself with the marked exits in the room. In the event of an emergency, please make your way to the nearest marked exit. Please follow the instructions of staff members and exit the building if necessary. Following today's interview, a limited number of audience questions will be answered. The Dole Institute aims to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your question with this in mind. Finally, I'd like to remind you to please silence your cell phones or place them in Do Not Disturb. Now please join me in welcoming Director of Programs and Student Affairs, Sarah Stacy.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much, Amy. I want to first say I'm sorry it's a little chilly in here. Please help yourself to some coffee in the back if you're cold. I also want to invite you on November 9th to attend our Tribute to Veterans Gala. For this, you do need to RSVP. We have some more information on the table right outside the room and also on our website. Please talk to me or another staff member if you want more information. It's a really nice night full of dancing, drinks, and good times, so talk to us if you're interested. So it's my great honor to introduce today's distinguished guest. Dr. Faulkner is a professor of military history, and he has taught at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College for over 20 years. He served 23 years in the U.S. Army and commanded a tank company in the 1st Armored Division during Operation Desert Storm. He's also authored books such as The School of Hard Knocks and Pershing's Crusaders, the American Soldier in World War II, for which he's won many, many awards. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Faulkner.
As always, it is a great pleasure to get a chance to speak here at the Dole Center. Now, it is especially a great pleasure because today, as she noted, I'd spent a lot of my career as a tanker. And as a World War I historian, of course, I'm fascinated with the development of the tank. Now, if that's the president, tell him I'll call him back. So, you know, at the Command and General Staff College, we spent a lot of time discussing the theories of the great Prussian theorist Karl von Clausewitz. In fact, every time I mention Clausewitz's name, I get a $500 bonus. So Clausewitz, 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 Clausewitz. But Clausewitz had some very interesting things to say about war. He said that war is always a contest of wills, where the enemy wants to win as much as you do. So what that means is, in combat, the enemy dictates to you as much as you dictate to him. Now that hasn't stopped armies throughout history from trying to do what I like to call the reverse golden rule. Do unto others and run away laughing before they can do unto you. Now, the great tank pioneer, J.F.C. Puller, actually said that a little bit more eloquently. You know, the soldier's dream is to give blows without receiving them. Now, since the dawn of organized warfare, we have seen this quest, and it's usually an attempt to get mobile, protected fire and shock power. And you even see it right here with the Sumerian chariot. You've got the mobility, but also you have guys holding shields, providing the protection, while the archer is laying waste to the enemy. And of course, you're all familiar with the medieval knight. Same idea. And so we start to see this quest develop. In fact, we're all familiar with Leonardo da Vinci, who in 1848 goes to his sponsor, Leviticus Sforza, and says, hey, have I got an idea for you? We're going to have a heavily armored and heavily equipped, let's just call it a tank, which will lay waste to all of your enemies. Now, here's a problem. Usually as you try to find mobile protected firepower, there's a trade-off. If you want heavy armor and you want heavy armament, that adds weight. And weight tends to mean that the vehicle then will suffer with mobility. You see this in Leonardo's design. This big, heavy, wooden armor with multiple cannons sticking out at all sides was propelled by 4 guys moving on a crankshaft. Okay? Now, in an era before modern gyms and steroids, you can imagine that this idea, sadly like many of Leonardo's, was never really practical. And it's not until you get to the Industrial Revolution with steam power and then petroleum power overtaking manpower and horsepower that you actually start to see the possibility of creating modern armored vehicles. Some of the designs, of course, get nowhere, but I love James Cowan's design here, okay? If you don't know it, any infantrymen here? Okay, we got it, okay. Be proud, come on. There's always a rivalry between tankers and infantrymen. What I love about Cowan's design is it actually has 4 scythe blades that come out the sides so the armor guys can mow down the infantry, literally, as the vehicle moves forward. But it's really not until the turn of the 19th, 20th century with petroleum power that you start to see the breakthroughs. And you see 2 of the major designs here. On one hand, you've got Joseph Diplock's ped rail system. What he basically does is take a big wheel, but you'll notice on the wheel are these huge elephant foot adaptions. And the idea, of course, is to spread the weight out so it better enables this vehicle to cross soft ground. A better design is ultimately David Roberts' Little Caterpillar. This is a tracked system, and of course that will become standard in almost every armored vehicle from 1916 onward. Now, this is such a good design that the American company Holt will purchase the patent, and over time they will transform from being the Holt agricultural tractor to Caterpillar, same thing we have today. Now, the British Army had an early interest in the use of this motive power to pull forward artillery. And they do a trial in 1907, and ultimately they sort of lose interest in it. But the idea is there. The great science fiction writer H.G. Wells in 1903 publishes a little short story. And in the story, he already accurately predicts that in the next great war, to survive the firepower revolution, the sides are going to dig into trenches. But in H.G. Wells' story, ultimately the British Army is routed when the enemy uses these huge armored and well-equipped vehicles using that ped rail system to crush the trenches, okay? In fact, these illustrations come from that short story. I sort of like this one, the infantry guys going, help, help, as they surrender to the tankers. What's interesting about this story is a number of the British tank pioneers will later reference having read H.G. Wells' story in their own writings after the war. So the seeds are there. And when the war breaks out in 1914, at first at least, it seems like it's going to be the type of war that they had prepared for, a massive war of maneuver. Now, the First Lord of the Admiralty is a guy named Winston Churchill. Perhaps you've heard of him. Old Churchill wants to get the Navy involved as much as possible in the war. And so he turns to this guy, Charles Sampson, right here, and says, I want you to take your aircraft squadron to Flanders and aid the Allies in air support as best you can. Now this guy is a fascinating character. Not only does he look a lot like Francis Drake, he acts a lot like Francis Drake. When he arrives in the Low Country, he quickly finds out that his aircraft, he can't keep enough of them operable to do much. Fortunately, his well-heeled pilots had come to France with their own personal automobiles, several of them being Rolls-Royces. He gets the idea to mount machine guns and some light armor on these vehicles and sends them against the advancing Germans on raids. Now, Winston Churchill always loves a good story. So he starts to direct his own naval engineers to make more and more of these armored cars. And let's face it, who wouldn't want to go to war in a Rolls-Royce? Unfortunately, as the armies start to settle into the trenches in the late fall of 1914, the shenanigans that Sampson had been doing had come to a close. But Churchill had now had that seed of thought planted in his mind, the idea that you can use mechanized warfare to aid in what's going to be a very ugly, ugly challenge. If you've seen my presentations before, these are some of my go-to slides, okay? We have something called the firepower revolution that occurs in the 50 years between the end of the American Civil War and the beginning of World War I. In that, you have the development of magazine bolt-action rifles, modern machine guns, and modern artillery. The war of maneuver ends after you simply start to run out of too many soldiers. And all the combatants realize if they're going to survive, they have to dig in. And so by November, all along what will become known as the Western Front, the armies are building two parallel lines of trenches. In fact, by the end of the war, these trenches will extend over 400 miles from the Franco-Swiss border all the way to the North Sea coast of Belgium. Over the winter of 1914-1915, these trenches will become elaborate defenses in depth. This is unprecedented in human history. And in war, more than any other human endeavor, necessity is the mother of invention. All of the armies believe that sooner or later, if they're going to win, they've got to push the other guy out of their trenches. Easy. The first challenge, of course, is simply getting up out of your trench and crossing no man's land. What could be easier? Oh, except the minute you step out of your trench, the enemy is hitting you with every bit of firepower that they possibly can. To make matters worse, forward of the enemy trenches are dense belts of barbed wire, sometimes 8 to 10 yards deep. You will notice as I go along, the go-to weapon of the Great War is field artillery. It'll be the biggest killing weapon of the war. So as this new system is developing it into ultimately what we consider field artillery tactics today, you are turning on it and relying upon it to enable you to do these tasks. If you've managed to cross no man's land, the next easy task is breaking into the first belt of enemy trenches. Now think about this. When you are breaking into the trenches, you have to clear them laterally, you have to clear them in depth, because it's a belt of trenches, several trenches put together, and also clear them subterranean. And again, you are turning to the artillery to help you out with this. Last but not least, if you've crossed no man's land, if you've broken into the second set of trenches, I mentioned this was an elaborate defense in depth. There's now a second belt of trench, depending on the terrain, a half kilometer or more back, followed by a third belt of trench. So now you have to have a whole new attack to break through the first belt of trenches and then follow on ultimately to break through the last belt of trenches. With artillery trying to do much of the heavy lifting. The problem is there's lags in technology. Weapons technology is going through the roof. Command and control technology is flat. So the artillery of the Great War is not responsive. And you're asking it to do a lot of stuff. They're trying to keep the glass balls always being juggled, and they keep dropping them. So you need something to pick up where the artillery fails. Very soon after the beginning of the Great War, you have a number of military leaders and policymakers scrambling to try to figure out how new technology can help them. In fact, 2 days after the French army suffers its worst losses in its history, the 22nd of August, 1914, where they lose 27,000 dead in one day, the respected French engineer Jean Estienne, will say the victory will ultimately come in this war by the first side who can figure out how to mate mobility with a cannon. No surprise that he will later go on to be the commander of all the French armored forces in the war. 2 months after Estienne puts this out, a British staff officer named Ernest Swinton goes on a tour of the Western Front. When he returns, he writes a memo to the War Office through Maurice Hankey that says, what we need now is a heavily armed vehicle on Caterpillar tractors to deal with this ever-thickening belt of trenches. The War Office, of course, is a mite bit busy running the war and pigeonholes the idea. Hankey, however, sees merit to it. And in December, he goes to see who? Winston Churchill. Convinces him of the need for this vehicle. Churchill immediately turns to his naval engineers, guys whose purpose is to design ships, and says, make me an armored vehicle. Oh, this is all done off the books. He figures out that off the books isn't good, so finally in early January of 1915, he goes to the Prime Minister and lays out exactly why the military needs these vehicles and the characteristics that they are required for them to do their job. Immediately after the Great War, the British government holds this Royal Commission on Awards to Inventors. And one of the really weighty subjects that they're trying to figure out for prizes and honors is who invented the tank. They quickly figured out that the old adage that success has 1,000,000 fathers, but failure is an orphan, was true. There are multiple people whose ideas go into making the tank. So you've got idea men. You, of course, have to then have boosters, people who push this forward, and, of course, the money men to pay for it. And no matter what you're doing with a new innovation, you're always going to have the skeptics. In this case, it was a very powerful skeptic, the Minister or Secretary of War, Herbert Kitchener, who's saying, I'm really not sure we need this after all. Churchill, though, is very successful in pushing the government, ultimately in February of 1915, to establish the Land Ship Committee. Now, the purpose of this committee was to design the type of armored vehicle that the military is going to need to solve this ever-expanding, ever-deadly belts of trenches that the Germans are building. They have rough design criteria. It has to have enough armor to defeat German small arms. It has to have enough armament to destroy German machine guns. It has to have the capability of crushing all those belts of German barbed wire. And lastly, it has to have enough width to cross a 12-foot trench. And you take a number of designers and engineers and automotive people and put them to work. Now, as you can imagine, under great duress and with a whole host of ideas, ultimately they fail as often as they succeed. In fact, all these lines down here were places to nowhere. Now, the Royal Army was invited to participate in the Land Ship Committee and chose only to send a handful of relatively low-level staff officers. They decided to go their own way, and so they conducted a test using the American Holt agricultural tractor. And after they put it through grueling paces that few things could pass, surprise, surprise, it failed. And so after that, George Scott Moncrief, who was responsible in the British Army for all trench warfare equipment designs, was more than happy to allow the Navy to spend its time and money developing the armored vehicle. Now, this tickled the hell out of Winston Churchill. He was happy to be the one who was pushing this forward, and he actually was quite tired of the foot dragging of the War Office. Without a doubt, the tank was born from the Royal Navy. In fact, even today, American tanks have turrets, sponsons, and back decks because of our association with the Royal Navy tank design. Now, ultimately, after a lot of wrangling and dealing with really sort of silly ideas like creating a vehicle that is bristling with cannons and machine guns and able to carry 18 to 48 fully equipped infantrymen, these two guys, William Triton and Walter Gordon Wilson, narrow the field down to two designs. Little Willie, which is arguably the first true tank, and Mother, or Big Willie. Now, as Wilson goes on, he decides that really what we have to put our money into is Mother. It's got all the capacity, all the capabilities that we need to accomplish the mission. Oh, by the way, it's no surprise that at the end, Trenton and Wilson are the ones who get the majority of the prize money for being the father of the tank. With Mother being fielded, the prototype, they now determined that it's time to introduce it to the stakeholders. So on the 2nd of February, Mother goes through a series of tests, going over obstacles, going over shell holes, going over trenches in front of staff members from Douglas Haig's army. And Douglas Haig is the commander of the British Army in France. They know they need something, so they're enthusiastic. David Lloyd George, who is the Minister of Munition, the guy who will have to be responsible for producing it, he's excited about it. The only guy that's not excited about it, guess who? Is Herbert Kitchener, who calls this thing merely a pretty mechanical toy. Despite his reservations, Lloyd George is so happy with the results that he immediately orders the production of 100 tanks. Now that we've got the tanks starting in production, you have to now create a whole new organization with its own tactics, its own doctrine, its own way of doing things out of nothing. Our old friend Swinton is going to take the role here, okay? So he's going to be the one responsible for training the new force. Now, to maintain security, because you want surprise when this thing happens, you disguise the name of the organization. It'll be called the Special Branch of the Machine Corps, the Heavy Branch of the Machine Gun Corps. And even the name tank is designed to bamboozle the Germans about what it is. As the training proceeds, of course, a lot of these tankers are training on whatever they can without any tanks. And when they get the tanks, the training is so stovepiped to maintain that secrecy that the tank crews never get a chance to train with the infantry that they will ultimately support. Swinton's lasting contribution is to create basically the first doctrinal idea of how these tanks will be used. To deal with inter-service parochialism, right off the bat, he says the tank is designed to aid the infantry in staying alive and accomplishing its mission. But he also makes clear that the British Army is going to have one chance to get this right. Because after the first time you use the tank, the surprise is gone. And he recommends often and early that the British Army should wait till it has a sufficient number of tanks so they can use them all en masse in a surprise attack that will rupture the German lines for decisive effect. But our old friend Douglas Haig has ideas of his own. He is an early enthusiastic supporter of the tanks, and he wants them now. In fact, he is already planning for a major assault on the Somme to begin ultimately in July of 1916. And he wants tanks, he wants tanks, he wants tanks. But in April of 1916, Swinton warns him, hey, look, I can't have the trained number of crews and I can't have the number of tanks you want at least until August, and even that turns out to be overly optimistic. Haig is not going to be dissuaded, even though the French are also begging him to hold off the use of the tank. They're already feverishly trying to catch up with the British. They want to delay the attack until 1917, until both armies have enough tanks to again have that decisive edge. Now, after the Battle of Somme begins without any tanks, it quickly turns into be a disaster. In fact, between the 1st of July and the middle of September, the Allies have already lost 270,000 casualties on the Somme. But about that time, Douglas Haig says, with the Russian success in the Brusilov offensive, with the Germans finally shutting down their attack in Verdun, and the success that the Italians are having, now is the time to strike. Now the German reserves of manpower have been so depleted that one more big attack on the Somme will break the lines right open. And he squeezes the War Office to finally produce the tanks. And the first tanks arrive in France in the middle of August. Now, these tanks have half-trained crews. They have little to no combat experience. and because of just the need to establish the organization in France, there is no time again for the tanks to train with the infantry they're going to support. Still, the Tank Corps manages to field 49 tanks. Now keep in mind, this is almost the entirety of the tanks in the world at this time for the use on this 15 September attack. But contrary to what Swinton had asked for, massed the tanks together, the British plan penny-packeted the existing British tanks among 10 divisions spread over 12 miles. Now when the Battle of Flers-Courcelette began, it actually went in some places according to plan. In some places, the tanks were able to move forward with the support of infantry and actually get to that third German line of defenses. You can sort of see where that occurs at Courcelette itself and also at Flers. In other places, though, the tanks broke down because it's still a new weapon system. They fell into shell holes or ditches and couldn't get out, or the Germans had knocked them out with field artillery. While some of the tanks individually managed to do some things on the battlefield, those individual success did not add up enough to really turn the tide of the battle. And while the attack was a tactical success, it failed to breach the German lines, and it still cost the British Army 2,700 casualties, 27,000, casualties. Despite that, it did seem that this tank had possibilities. And with Haig's encouragement, Lloyd George agreed to produce 1,000 more tanks. Now, and of course, Douglas Haig continued to want to use these tanks, but the tankers themselves had realized that there were problems with that Mark I tank. First of all, the petroleum tank was inside the crew compartment. Okay. Bad, okay? The design itself had, in the beginning, these big wheels in the back to help with steering. At best, they were sort of pointless. At worst, they would actually hurt the tank as it was going through it. So let's get rid of that. The early tanks also had no mufflers, and the smokestacks were not sealed. So what that meant was the crew could actually not hear what was going on in the tank over the noise. Oh, that lack of sealed smokestack meant that cinders were coming inside the tank. Remember what I said about the fuel tank? Okay? And it raised the temperature so much in the tank that they were operating at about 100-degree temperature throughout the battle. Oh, in a state of near asphyxiation. So the new Mark IV tank was designed to fix that. Haig had big plans for 1917. He was going to attack at Arras. He was going to attack at Vimy Ridge. He was going to attack at Bullecourt. And ultimately, his greatest offensive would be in Ypres. This battle will also be known as Passchendaele. Now, the tanks are still trying to be built. You just saw how many were lost. In fact, just to support the Battle of Arras, the Tank Corps, what will become now the Tank Corps, has to grab hold of all the tanks they have in their training base, both in Britain and in France, just to scrape together 60 tanks to support the attack. They arrive too late and have no effect on the battlefield. When it came to the Third Battle of Ypres, they're ultimately able to put together 180 tanks. The attack would be preceded by the largest British bombardment of the war, a 16-day preliminary bombardment, which of course shell cratered the entire battle area. Oh, that bombardment also destroyed the very delicate irrigation system that had been laid out in the region. Keep in mind that in Flanders, oftentimes the water table is only about a foot under the ground. Oh, to make things really worse, on the 31st of July when the battle begins, torrential rains begin to fall and will continue on throughout the majority of the campaign. It turned the battle area in most places into a swamp. So when the tanks went forward, that's what happens. Most of the tanks bog down. The few tanks that don't bog down are limited to very narrow, easily targeted corridors. And even though the Tank Corps continued to feed more and more tanks into the action, they contributed almost nothing to the outcome of the battle. Now, Ypres Passchendaele was the low point of the tank corps for the war. In fact, it had performed so dismally that you have a number of people inside the War Office saying, is it really worth the amount of manpower and production that we're putting in to this half-proven technology? So the commander of the tank corps, Hugh Ellis, and his operations officer, JFC Fuller, know that they're under the gun to produce results. The first thing they do is to recognize they have a problem. They've been playing make it up as they go along throughout the whole first year of the tank's development. So for the first time, what they're trying to do is create a coherent doctrine for the tank corps, firmly planted into the lessons learned. They realized that after its dismal performance at Arras and Bullecourt and Ypres, the British infantry had no faith and confidence in the tank at all. And that Swinton was right. If this thing was going to be successful, it had to operate as a combined arms team. In other words, the tanks had to operate well with the infantry, and oh, by the way, also with the artillery and aviation. So Ellis puts a lot of effort to restore the faith and confidence of the infantry through a lot of training between the two. Fuller will spend some time on what today we'd call battle drills. This is how these two things need to operate together to restore the faith of the infantry and actually accomplish something. So the doctrine that comes out is let the tanks lead, let the tanks go through the barbed wire. Once they're through the barbed wire with the infantry right behind them, then the tanks split off, target the infantry, the German infantry, in between the tank sections while the infantry moves forward and clears the trenches. They also realized that they need some specialty tanks. Mobile operations use petrol. So maybe we need some tanks that just carry a bunch of ammunition and petrol to increase the range of the tanks. And oh, by the way, since the tanks are spread out, maybe we need to take and make a couple of special communications tanks with wireless radio so Ellis and the rest of these guys can coordinate the movement. Oh, last but not least, while they're doing this, they also realize that now that the cat is out of the bag, the Germans are actively trying to find out ways to destroy the tanks. They're doing this by fielding small arms, armor-piercing ammunition to their infantry and machine gunners. They're doing this by training some of their light artillery guys how to use anti-tank tactics, and they're doing something that's quite simple. If the width of the tank is 10 feet, make your trenches 12 feet. So that way the tank falls in. By the end of 1917, it's not been going well for the British home team. Interestingly, two British officers, JFC Fuller and Hugh Tudor, come up with a solution. They fully understand that this is an attritional war. And the way that you win attritional war is ultimately, how do I say this delicately, pile up more enemy dead than you yourself are suffering. Those big offensives aren't necessarily getting there. What both of these guys propose independently is now for the British Army to launch a series of limited raids, all focused on killing as many Germans as possible and then withdrawing before the Germans can respond. Fuller, of course, believes the best way to do that is a combined arms attack with tanks. The tanks and infantry will move forward, create as much havoc as possible, possibly destroy the enemy artillery, and then withdraw. Tudor, who, by the way, will lead the British Black and Tan campaign in Ireland after the war, is an artillery guy. And he says, how about this? Throughout the war, we've given away the element of surprise. We launched these massive preliminary bombardments. The enemy knows we're coming. We now have aircraft and maps that can pinpoint the German locations before the attack. Don't give away the surprise. But at 0 hour, use these predictive fires to hit the Germans right when we need them. And then have the artillery support the infantry as they move forward. Now, the commander of the British Third Army, Julian Byng, liked both of these ideas and directed his staff to combine them. Ultimately, that will all come together in the Battle of Cambrai. Now, they select Cambrai because it's one of the few areas of the Western Front that is easily trafficable by tank because it hasn't been bombed like the surface of the moon. The attack is going to mass together over 476 tanks. 1,000 artillery pieces, and also roughly 600 aircraft. It is designed to be a combined arms attack. You will notice that these tanks have what's known as rolls of fascines. These are big, huge bundles of sticks that are chained together. They're 4.5 foot wide, they're 10 foot long. Some of these tanks will have those together. When the tank comes up to the 12-foot German trench, they drop the fascines in, and then the 10-foot long tank can bridge across them. The attack, of course, will proceed by predictive fires. Simultaneously with the attack, the Royal Air Corps will sweep in and attack the 2nd and 3rd trench belts of the German army and also their command posts and artillery pieces. When this attack kicks off on the 20th of November, for the most part, it's a great success. The Germans are caught by surprise, and the British are able to make huge advances. Now, you will notice that there is a big place in the line around Flesker's Ridge where they don't make a big advance. Here, due to bad luck for the British, the Germans have taken one of those light artillery battery with anti-tank training and have put in the reverse slope. And in this area of the front, the British lose between 20 and 40 tanks. The sources differ, but it's definitely not a good day. But after 8 hours of fighting, this attack has already captured more ground than the British had in 3 months of fighting at Passchendaele. This has been a success. The church bells start to ring in England. Woo-hoo! This has been such a success that the generals start to go, damn, maybe we can keep going. And they will continue the attack for another 8 days. Unfortunately, the surprise is gone. So every day they continue on, they're taking minimal amount of ground and suffering more and more casualties. Ultimately, at the 8th day, they just run out of steam. And then on the 30th of November, in a preview of what the Germans will do in 1918, they use innovative storm troop tactics and innovative artillery tactics to launch a massive counterattack against the British line that ultimately robs the British of their ill-gotten gains. But we started to see the possibility of this weapon system. But when 1918 dawns, it's still not looking good for the Allied home team. The collapse of the Russians due to the Bolshevik Revolution has now freed up massive numbers of Germans to be used on the Western Front. And Erich Ludendorff and the commander of the German army, Paul von Hindenburg, have figured out that now is the time. Let's launch a massive counterattack against the Allies and knock them out of the war before millions of young, fresh Americans can make their presence felt. When they attack on the 21st of March, in what will become known as the Ludendorff offensives, it catches the Allies absolutely by surprise. In fact, the tank corps had been arrayed, spread out along a 60-mile defensive corridor in place to, in theory, quickly counterattack to help seal any potential German attack. The German attack is so violent and moves so rapidly that the tank corps, like much of the rest of the British Army, is caught by surprise. And now they are scrambling to try to figure out. Again, the command posts have been taken out. Their supply depots have been taken out. And a lot of the times the tanks are just wandering aimlessly around the battlefield looking for some Germans to shoot until they're destroyed or they run out of fuel. In fact, in one case, an entire battalion of British tanks is abandoned and destroyed because somebody prematurely destroys the Bree River Bridge. And the tanks battalion is caught on the wrong side of the Somme River. In the midst of this disaster, though, the tankers do the best they can. A number of these crews that abandon their tanks take the machine guns with them, and the tank corps forms 113 Lewis gun sections, which helps to sort of slow down the German advance. The attack on the Somme for the Germans, again, starts to run out of steam. And what happens then is sort of a fascinating event. On the 24th of April, the Germans have the first use of their own domestic-produced tank, the A7V. And it'll also be the first tank versus tank battle. They'll have 4 of these German A7Vs attack against the British line. In the process, 2 British female tanks and a female tank only is equipped with machine guns, will be knocked out by the German tanks. A British mail tank equipped with cannons will come to their rescue. They'll destroy one of the German tanks and drive their others from the field before it itself is damaged by artillery. In another one, the new tank, the Whippet-fast tank, which goes a whopping 7 miles per hour, will see its first combat debut. And in one instance, 7 of these tanks, with only 21 tankers, will attack a German battalion of over 1,200 infantrymen. In the process, 21 tankers will kill 400 Germans and scatter the rest. By the middle of the summer of 1918, though, the Germans have ran out of steam. They've suffered horrendous casualties. And at this point, British and French attacks have started to change the direction of the war. The British combined arms attack, mostly led by Australians with some American divisions supporting, will launch a massive combined arms attack at Hamel on the 4th of July. At the end of the month, the British, the French, and the Americans will launch a counterattack at Soissons. Based upon these 2 victories, the generalissimo of all the Allied armies, Ferdinand Foch, decides that now is the time to go on a massive counteroffensive all along the Allied lines. Everybody will attack simultaneously to hold down the Germans and to trick them as they go forward. Based on the success at Hamel, the British High Command says, let's replicate the special sauce in that battle on a larger scale. This will lead to the largest combined arms battle of World War I, the Battle of Amiens. Now, the battle itself is designed to simply push the German artillery out of the range so it can't lob artillery shells into the key railhead in the city of Amiens. But it's also designed to do what Foch says, put pressure on the Germans all along the line. Here, they're putting all the pieces together. For this battle, there'll be over 500 tanks supporting 25 divisions, backed up by 2,000 artillery pieces and 1,000 aircraft. Again, the British are going to use predicted fires, no preliminary fires. And they're so good at pinpointing the German locations that when they begin their bombardment exactly at 0 hours, within a few minutes they've destroyed 80% of the German artillery in the area. Then the attack goes forward, with the infantry and the armor working well together, with the artillery supporting with rolling barrage. They're crossing through the German lines. Simultaneously, the Royal Air Force, now with a new name change, is attacking deep behind the German lines to disrupt their communications, disrupt their command posts, disrupt their supplies, and keep reinforcements from coming forward. Once the tank and the infantry knock a hole in the German lines, the Allies exploit this attack with fast Whippet tanks, with armored cars, and guess what? Horse cavalry. Hey, World War I is attritional. Despite this tactical success, it still cost the Allies 40,000 casualties. But in return, they have killed or wounded 45,000 Germans and captured 30,000 more. 45,000 and 3,000 more, okay? Erich Ludendorff will later say, this was the black day of the German army. But as I said, this is an attritional war. The tank has shown promise. It's showing the gleam of the shape of things to come, but at the same time, it still has to overcome its mechanical unreliability. Hey, if you are the guys running the tank corps, you sort of know that by the end of the 12th of August, you have no tanks left. Not only are you suffering from breakdowns, but the Germans have started to learn. In 1918, they fielded this. Now, I have one, but they wouldn't let me bring it. The first purpose-built anti-tank weapon, the Tankgewehr. It's basically a standard Mauser bolt-action rifle that they shove steroids down the barrel. So it's about this tall, it weighs about 45 rounds, and it fires this 13-millimeter cartridge, slightly bigger than a 50 cal. At the right range and at the right angle, this will punch holes through the armor all day long. The glimmers are there. In the midst of the Ludendorff offensive, J.F. Seefeller, whose brain is always going, is coming up with his plan to fight the war into 1919. Because again, it's not evident at the beginning of this that this is going to turn out, that the war will end in 1918. He proposes that the British field a massive motorized and mechanized force. The goal of this is going to be different. It's not going to be simply to kill Germans. Ultimately, he says the quickest way to end the war is what he calls the pistol shot to the brain. We're going to use a bunch of different toys in an interesting mix. First, you're going to have these medium tanks supported by aircraft attacks. They're going to go through the lines. They're going to go deep. They're going to destroy the things that makes the German army click. We're going to take out command posts, and we're going to take out the German artillery. Without the artillery, the Germans can't hold. Without the command post, we had an old saying in the Army, when in danger, when in doubt, run in circles, scream and shout. And the confusion that's created by the lack of those command posts, the newly fielded heavy tanks supporting the infantry will then rupture the line. Once the lines are ruptured, more of the light tanks and truck-mounted infantry will go through the breach, continuing the pursuit of the German army till the German army no longer exists. Now, let's be honest, nice on paper. The British do not have the capability of actually pulling this off, but you start to see the seeds of what will come to fruition in World War II. So, I know we're all excited about tanks now. So, what are your questions? Hey, I initially set out to do all of the armies using tanks, and I quickly found that, my reach exceeded my grasp. So if you have questions about how the other armies use tanks, I might be able to fill those too. I've stunned you into silence. Excellent. Tom Huber, who always has to be first. First in the heart of his countrymen.
I enjoyed your presentation very much, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk about some of the other powers' use of tanks. And the question is, do the Germans produce tanks in numbers like this, and do they develop any doctrine like this during World War I?
No, there. The Germans have won the tank reviews, both at Fleurs-Courcelette, but definitely during the battle at Passchendaele. They go, why waste our limited resources? And the Germans have very limited resources on a tool that doesn't seem to be very effective. So the design of the German panzers, even though some of the guys are pushing for it, never starts to really gain much emphasis. That will change after Cambrai. It's like, I got to wake up and smell the coffee. But now they're playing deep catch-up. They only produce 20 of those A7V tanks before the war is over. Only one of them exists. It's in the Australian War Memorial. Ironically, the vast majority of tanks that the Germans use in World War I are captured Allied tanks. We leave behind 100 tanks that Cambrai destroyed. The Germans take and try to rebuild them, put parts together. So the majority of the tanks that they will use in the war are actually Allied tanks. But they never are able to really put together a coherent way of doing this. The French, on the other hand, give the British a run for their money. Even though they are late to the game for a host of, one corporation wants credit for doing this and that. By the end of the war, they're creating almost the same number of tanks that the British are. And some of their designs, like the FD-17 light tanks, one of the best designs of armor in the war. In fact, the vast majority of American tanks used in the war are French tanks with French doctrine and French training. So, good question. Thank you, Tom. Yes, sir.
Yeah. How did the tanks interact with the poison gas? Was there any attempts to or concern or problems created by operating in a poison gas environment?
No more than anybody else. They go through the same training for wearing gas masks. So who here has worn a gas mask? A pleasant experience, is it not? Okay. Now wear that pleasant experience inside a tank that's 100 degrees and you're still not coming out with the fumes. And so there's no special thing. There's the talk about how do we put a filter on. They never can work it out. So if you come under gas attack, you're wearing the same mask that the infantry guys are. And you're already restrained from what you can see inside the tank. And for those that have worn masks inside a tank, once you put the gas mask on, it even further narrows your ability to see. So good question. Thank you, Gary. Babo.
Yeah, the tank that's in the World War I museum, obviously the small French tank that,
Yes.
that we get. Did we ever try to build a bigger one, or did the French try to build a bigger one?
So this Mark 8 heavy tank is known as the Liberty tank in the United States. It is a co-design between the Americans and the British. And so the whole idea is now you're going to produce a huge tank that if the Germans start to expand the size of their trenches, it will easily go over the top, and it has a lot more armament. So in theory, it's going to do a lot more damage. We never produce them in any number, and they never see combat before the war is over. Though they'll continue in the American inventory up to the 1930s. Yeah, good question. Thank you.
Tell us a little bit more about life inside the tank. Who were these people? What skills did they have, and how did they survive compared to the other deployments?
Good question. These tanks have a 10-man crew. Okay? You've got the driver, you've got the tank commander right next to them. You have a couple of guys that serve the weapons. Then you have the engineers that are trying to keep the thing moving forward. It's a miserable thing to be in. First of all, if you look at, and it's hard to see, if you look at the side here, the way you get into the tank is from hatches on the top or hatches in the back of the sponsons. The hatches are about that tall, and you and I are about this tall. So if this thing catches fire, you've got a deep problem, just being able to get out of the tank. When the Germans start to issue the armor-piercing ammunition, it doesn't pierce the armor. So we're talking about an infantryman, German infantryman, have like 5 rounds of this ammunition. The machine gunners will have a belt of the ammunition. While it does not penetrate the armor, when it hits against the armor, what it creates is called spall. In other words, little pieces of the armor plate will actually break off inside the tank and go careening around. The early British tankers will actually have a mask with chainmail hanging down and eye slits to protect their eyes from that spalling. Again, the temperatures are high. Even in the later tanks with the mufflers, it's still hard to hear. So oftentimes the commands are being given by banging wrenches against the metal to catch people's attention. When it comes to the training, you're getting soldiers from across the British Army for their officers, right? This seems like a cool new thing. We're going to join this. You'll get the same thing for volunteers, oftentimes from the infantry. They try to get people with some mechanical training, though people with mechanical training is needed all across the British war effort. So oftentimes you get who you can and train them the best that you can. So it's an interesting experience. When it comes to the early Mark I tank, it's got a gravity-fed gas tank. So if you go up too much of a rise, the flow of fuel to the engine cuts off. And so in the midst of this, you have to physically take gasoline in this hot tank with all those sparks flying around and put it at the top of the carburetor to restart the tank. So we've come a little bit further since then. I can't give you the exact number on that. These things are not proof against artillery. They tend to attract the eye, as you can imagine. So most of the casualties, just like most of the casualties of the infantry, come from the artillery. And the casualty rates in the British Army are so horrible, I wouldn't be able to tell you, is the casualty rate greater here than not? In the American Army, the casualty rates for tank crews is much lower than the infantry. Okay? In fact, we'll lose a lot more infantry officers than the whole tank corps combined in the war. A good question. You guys fight over it.
Explain again the logs that they put on the back of the tank.
Yeah.
Were they used to fill up the the trench, or
So
were
you're
they
talking
used
about this here. Are we talking about
the stack of wood on the back
Yeah.
of the?
the fascines?
Was that to build a bridge, or was it to fill up the trench?
Both. Both.
Wow.
It's mostly to fill up the trench. Again, as the Germans start to expand the width of the trench, you will take these. And there's actually being made, this is for Jeff Babb, they're being created, put together by over 1,000 Chinese laborers behind the lines. And they're literally taking big branches of trees, chaining them together. So things weigh several hundred pounds. You put them on the top, you have a little quick release mechanism, you drive up to the trench, you cut the release mechanism, it rolls off the front, and then the tank can cross it. It also has the ability then to sort of cordon off the German maneuver inside the tank.
Are the logs like this, or are they like a bridge going across?
No, they fall into the trench. So the big thing will roll into the trench, which will provide enough support for the tank to roll over the 12-foot.
Wow, they got to be pretty strong to hold those tanks.
Well, you know, again, we're talking about, think about, you know, the Romans had something called the fasces. That's where this comes from, right? Which is a bundle of sticks is always stronger than a single stick. So it's the same idea. And this is not new, that in siege warfare, you'd already had these to throw into trenches as you went along. So they're just basically scaling this up. And if you'll notice on the back of the tank here, you've got a big freaking railroad tie. That's an unditching beam. So if you get stuck in the mud, you can tie that, under fire of course, to the tracks, and basically it's like putting a sandbag in front of your car on an icy trip, get you enough stuff to get you out of the hole. Good question.
Can you tell us a little bit, please, about the development of the tank over the next 20 years and how, if I'm not mistaken, the Germans were well ahead of everyone else?
That's another 45-minute lecture, okay? It's a myth that the Germans are more advanced than anybody else, okay? In fact, after this, in the 1920s, the British will launch a series of armored tests. JFC Fuller, who was offered the command of this experimental brigade for some silly reasons, turns it down. And so the British will be well far advanced in armored development and combined arms warfare, fully mechanized artillery, infantry, and armor moving together. The problem is there are opponents of that inside the British military, specifically from the horse cavalry. And so even though they are having success doctrinally, they don't learn much from it in the long term. The Germans send observers to that. So ironically, the Germans will learn more from the British experiments than they will. When it comes to the army with the most advanced armored doctrine, it's the Soviets, by far. When the Germans are barely able, thinking about putting together a panzer division, the Soviets already have fully armored Panzer Corps supported by front aviation, paratroopers, everything that later will come to pass in the early years of World War II.
Weren't the German tanks faster, better?
No. If you look at, it's you know, the History Channel with, you know, the deep history of Hitler's underpants, that if you look at the Allied tanks in 1940, the British and the French have more tanks than the Germans, and their tanks are better. They're better armed, they're better armored. Their problem is they're fighting a defensive war, so they don't have much range. So the Germans have a good way of thinking about how to solve problems, and frankly, in France in 1940, they get very lucky. Okay? That luck will run out the next year. So, but good question. Thank you. Did you? No, go ahead.
Sorry. Would this impact J. Walter Christie, who made the BT-2?
Oh yeah, he plays around with these. Once the tank sort of reaches a little bit of its teenage years, there's all sorts of ideas that come out how to improve it. And Christie's one of these inventors who comes up with the idea, you know, treads are nice, but you know, if we create an all-wheel drive, you can actually run these tanks on wheels. He'll try to sell that to the U.S. Army. He asks for some outrageous terms in some cases. The Army has interest in it. And so ultimately he'll sell his idea to the Soviets. So the T-34 and a lot of the other Soviet tanks of World War II have that Christie suspension system. So yeah, good question. Thank you. Go ahead, the guy from the 1st Armored Division.
I'm all right. So you did say with the first tanks, it was very loud in there. Do you know about how long it took them to integrate comm systems inside of the tank?
That doesn't come really till the end of World War II, or World War I, to the 1920s and 1930s. In some of the wireless tanks, the ones that have, and you want to see something that sticks out a bit on the battlefield, the shoot me pole, okay? Once you start to try to put wireless radio, which is still pretty large, a big system, the guys inside that have to wear, an earphone to make themselves heard. But for most of the guys, banging on metal, screaming their lungs out to try to get the attention of the other crew members. It is, but we got the CVCs, right? Are you a tanker?
I am. We're all tanking.
Look at that. Love you guys, okay? Love you guys. Please feel free to make fun of the infantry on your way out. So.
Were most of the tanks diesel or gas?
Gas. Yes, MoGas, which of course.
So no diesel in World War I?
Oh, there's diesel. It's just not being used in these armored vehicles.
No, but at all?
Yeah, in fact, diesel, the German engineered diesel has already come up.
What I'm asking is there was no diesel tanks at all?
As far as I know, not. I could be wrong on that. And the production tanks, they're petrol, okay? With all the fun that comes from that.
So why do the Soviets use diesel later on?
Well, most of the powers, with the exception of the Americans, will go with diesel just because it's not as explosive. If you look at the early Sherman tanks, though, they still have MoGas engines. And so sometimes those early tanks like the Lee, they're called Ronsons after the popular lighter because they just sort of burn up. And it's really not, I think, and maybe I'm mistaken here, till the latter half of 1944 that we also start to go with more diesel vehicles. Okay, good question.
Hey, Sean, I'm obligated to put in some air power here. Coordination between artillery, armor, and air. Any fratricide, or what were the challenges that needed to be overcome?
Okay, so if you look at command and control technology, it's flat. Weapons technology, machine guns, artillery, all this stuff was going through the roof. The problem that broke down is how do you communicate between the elements? The most advanced command and control system in World War I, going into World War I, throughout really most of it, was landline. In other words, telephones. In fact, some of these early signal tanks actually spooled out telephone lines as they went forward. Now, probably not good around a bunch of tracked vehicles, not good when there's a bunch of artillery, and so over time, the British specifically will start to develop small wireless sets, and they'll put the small wireless sets inside their aircraft. When the aircraft flies over and finds a target, they will transmit the location of that target back to a receiver set in the artillery battery. Remember what I said, a receiver set. So you never really know if the message sent is actually received until really much later in the war. But like everything else, aviation is moving fast because necessity is the mother of invention in war more than anything else. So the armies that go into World War I look radically different from the armies that end World War I. In fact, there's an argument that if you took a British infantry battalion commander from the Battle of Waterloo, fighting against Napoleon in 1815, put him in a time machine and moved him 99 years to the future, to the opening of World War I, he basically understands the battlefield. That despite the machine guns and all, artillery still operates the way artillery did, infantry still operated the way infantry did, and cavalry operated the way cavalry did in their time. But if you were to take a British infantry battalion commander from 1914, put him in a time machine and just move him 3 years to the future, he's lost. The parts don't work the way they did anymore. So that just sort of shows you how radical this period is. Good question.
Did they have gunneries? Did they do gunnery?
Limited amounts. Okay. They do as they can. In fact, before the tanks arrive, a lot of these guys spend their time just having a mounted cannon that they would pop away on things. That's radically different from sitting in a tank that's moving across shell fire. So what they try to do was short halts. Stop, pop, 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 move forward. Okay. And you know the problem with doing that. Okay. And we actually won't figure that out until the late 70s with stabilization gear on our tanks. Yeah.
Did the United States Army, all this was going on, did they take the lessons learned from all the mistakes that they made with these tanks? Did they take those lessons learned and bring them back?
Prior to World War I or after?
After.
Yes. But there's so many lessons to learn, right? The AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, will hold, and then the Army will hold a series of, let's just call them lessons learned boards after World War I. One of them is the Superior Board. And people are debating back and forth about what should we put our money into, what is sort of a waste in time and effort. There are several people in the AEF that say, let's just get rid of the tanks. They're a weapon designed exclusively for trench warfare. We're never going to fight that again. Do we really need them? In the National Defense Act of 1920, the tank corps that we establish will be disbanded, and the remaining tanks will be given to the infantry, who have varying degrees of interest in what to do about it. Interestingly, for armored infantry guys, everybody else, one of the recommendations is also get rid of mortars. That was just something for World War I. We don't need them anymore. So there is an effort, but all efforts have stakeholders. All efforts have, pet rocks, and so there's a period there where armor development in the United States just sort of grinds to a halt. In fact, it's not until the success of the German Panzers in 1940 that we decide to reform an armored force. Good question. Round's complete.
I'll make a comment. In the mid-70s, medium tank recovery vehicles, M88s, those were gasoline powered. Then the 88 A1 came out. It was diesel powered. Mm-hmm. Didn't have near the power that 88 had.
Yeah.
And I was in an 8-inch battalion. We had one 88 in our service battery. 2nd Armored Division, their 8-inch battalion had one 88. And those maintenance techs from those armor battalions were always up there wanting to get their hands on our
Of course. Of course. One 88 is good. Multiple 88s is better, right?
Well, no, they wanted that. The 88A1s were diesel.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Okay, folks, hey, I appreciate you coming out tonight. Thank you for your time. Hopefully you got something out of this. Since my comrades and I are furloughed, I will pass a tip jar. No, only kidding.